Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to wait just a minute or two for everyone to populate into the webinar, and then we'll get started. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Humanities Forum. My name is Raymond Hain, and I'm a member of the Philosophy Department here at Providence College and the director of the forum. The Humanities Forum, now in its 6th year, exists to provide a regular space on campus for the entire community to reflect on some of the deepest human things. We host guests from on and off campus and include artistic performances, lectures, panel discussions, debates, and film screenings. We have an exciting schedule of upcoming events, and our schedule and recordings of past events are always available on our website. It's my pleasure now to introduce our first event of this spring semester, a collaboration between the Forum and the Frederick Douglass Project here at PC, made possible in part by the generous support of the Jack Miller Center. The host of today's forum is Professor Ian Bernhoft, a member of the Providence College English Department and the organizer of the Frederick Douglass Project. Today's guest is the first of 3 special guests hosted by the forum this spring in connection with the Frederick Douglass Project. As a reminder, today's presentation and discussion will be recorded and made available on our website shortly after its conclusion. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, and I turn things over now to Professor Bernhoft, who will introduce our distinguished guest.
All right, welcome everybody. It is my pleasure today to introduce Professor Glenn Loury, the Merton P. Stoltz Professor of the Social Sciences and Professor of Economics at Brown University. Now, as the length of that title ought to suggest to you, Professor Loury is a towering figure in the field of economics and one of America's foremost voices on matters of race and public policy. After completing a PhD in economics at MIT, Professor Loury taught at Northwestern and the University of Michigan before becoming a full professor at Harvard University before the tender age of 40. He joined Brown University in 2005. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the Council on Foreign Relations. Now, it would be an understatement to say that Professor Loury has written widely. He has been prolific in his economic scholarship and in his writing on matters of racial inequality, incarceration, and social mobility, both in academia and in the popular press. And while I am unable to speak firsthand about his much lauded contributions to the field of economics, given that I wouldn't recognize a linear regression if it took me out for tea on a rainy day, I can say with conviction that his writing resounds with stylistic elegance and moral force. And what I most admire about Professor Loury's thought, and what I suspect you will see for yourself today, is his refusal to bow before the prevailing winds of political or ideological orthodoxy. For this, he is sometimes called a contrarian, but perhaps a better term is independently minded, rigorous in his commitment to both humanistic expression and science. I'm sure you'll have questions to ask, and so please feel free to chat them in real time using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And at the conclusion of Professor Loury's talk, we will discuss and answer as many as we can in the time we have allotted. So without further ado, let's welcome Professor Loury.
Thank you very much, Ian Bernhoft. I really appreciate the generous introduction, and thanks to those who've turned out. We're neighbors here in Providence, so why not talk to each other? I think that's a good idea. So the title of my lecture here is Equality of Representation versus Equality of Respect. I want to address myself to the ethics of racial affirmative action in American higher education. And I'm going to begin with a provocation. Affirmative action in American higher education is not about equality. It's about covering ass. In saying this, I wish to draw the listener's attention to the difference between the university's interest in admitting a diverse profile of students and the long-term interest rightly understood of a population that may be beneficiaries of such largesse. For me, genuine equality is distinct from titular equality. Substantive equality is not the same as optics equality. Equality of respect honor, dignity, and standing, equality of achievement and mastery. These are not the same things as the statistical parity of demographic groups. That is, true equality, the only equality worthy of the name, in my view, is distinct from today's popular sloganeering that celebrates diversity, equity, and inclusion for what are euphemistically referred to as historically underrepresented groups. Transparently, that phrase is but a way to avoid saying for non white identity groups that do not perform well on standardized tests. An affirmative action policy that amounts to permanently employing lower standards of academic qualification for admitting Black applicants into a competitive academic venue is, on this argument, not really an egalitarian policy at all. Rather, it is a patronizing and dishonest end run around the very difficult task of developing the full human potential of all of our people, regardless of race. As we stand here a half century past the advent of racial preferences in higher education admissions, I'm urging that we think carefully about institutionalizing a system of selection that relies on racially differential standards. Such a system surely can achieve equality of representation, no doubt, but over the longer term, I'm arguing it is not consistent with achieving genuine equality of respect. I set this argument within an historical context. African Americans emerging from slavery, Jim Crow segregation, and widespread discrimination have actually been diminished in terms of the development of our competitive and productive capacities. Education was not equal in 1930 or in 1950 or in 1970 for Blacks and whites. There were negative consequences of discrimination in employment, segregation of residential neighborhoods, and so on, which impeded the development within the African American population of our latent potential for academic performance. Given such a history, one could not expect that at day one there would have been equality of test scores or other measures of achievement, since background conditions did not afford Blacks an equal chance to realize our full human potential. That was the status quo ante from which affirmative action emerged a half century ago, the baseline from which we've endeavored to move towards something more equal. I see this as a difficult historical challenge, and I think we're now at a crossroads. We need to step back and reevaluate. I'm not here objecting to affirmative action in principle by declaring that it's unjust racial discrimination in reverse, that it's unfair to white people or to Asians. It may or may not be, but that's not my argument. As an historical matter, in the transition from the status quo ante of exclusion, it was both necessary and proper, I think, to rely upon some preferential methods as a temporary stopgap mechanism. But at the end of the day, we must address fundamental developmental deficits that impede the ability of African Americans to compete. And we're not doing this effectively. Rather, we're settling into a second best remedy, the use of lower admission standards for Blacks. This, in my view, is a profound error. It's a mistake. I'm not arguing to use racial preferences to cover for the consequences I'm not arguing against, I'm sorry. I am arguing to use racial preferences to cover for the consequences of our racially unjust history is cheap grace for elite higher education. And ultimately, Black people are the ones left with the short end of this deal. 4, permanently relying on racial preference to select elites invites patronization, condescension, contempt, dishonesty, shame, and the general erosion of standards in those selective venues where the competition for status is most keen. I'm not here concerned with any particular mechanism of selection. You may not like the SAT test. You may prefer to rely on letters of recommendation or on high school grade point averages or whatever for college admissions. But whatever the mechanism of selection, it should eventually be applied in the same way for selecting African Americans as others, or else the result will in the end fall short of what I'm calling genuine equality. This is a statistical, not an ethical argument. Either the criteria used to select students, SAT scores, ACT scores, high school grades, advanced placement classes, and so forth, are correlated with the post selection performance of the person who is admitted to that competitive venue, or those criteria are not. If they are not correlated with post admissions performance, we shouldn't be using them at all. Why would we use them if they were not predictive of how people perform after being selected? But if they are correlated, as I believe is in fact the case, then to use them differently for African Americans than for others is to ensure that there will be, on the average, different performances post admissions. That's what correlation means for Blacks than for others. Now, here's my point. Different average performance by race in a highly competitive and elite setting is simply not equality. We can pretend it doesn't exist. We can look the other way. We can grade inflate. We can formulate various institutional responses to the fact of racially differential average performances in our competitive venues. We can live with the result, especially since the beneficiaries of affirmative action are a relatively small part of an institution's overall student body. But such a circumstance is not equality. What I'm trying to get at here is that we should be concerned about the quality of racial equality. This is the difference between counting people by race while saying that we are diverse and inclusive on the one hand, and as a society adopting methods for developing and measuring the performance of our young people, which give them the chance to achieve genuine equality of honor, standing, and respect. People are going to accuse me here of stigmatizing students of color who benefit from affirmative action because I point to post-admissions performance differences by race as grounds for my concern. That is a red herring. Bear in mind, I'm talking about selection at the right tail when distinguishing between ass-covering representation and substantive equality. I'm not talking about selection in the fat part of the population distribution. The chosen are expected to be exceptional performers. The honor conveyed to them comes from the distinction of having been identified as one of those young people in society who truly excel, who are capable of extraordinary achievement, who are in the top 5 or 10% or whatever. Thus, at my home university, Brown, where I teach, we admit 1,800 students or so each year out of more than 30,000 applications. Likewise at Harvard. The fact of having been selected is meant to convey that you've been vetted, compared to others, and found to be an outstanding prospect among your peers. That is an honor, a certification of merit. Note, affirmative action in higher education is really only practiced at top-tier universities. Such mechanisms of selection stamp people and certify them as being extraordinary among their peers. We are now, in effect, committing ourselves to making those kinds of certifications separately by racial identity group, an unavoidable implication of using race as a criterion of admissions alongside standard academic achievement criteria. The economist Peter R.C. Diacano, who was an expert witness for plaintiffs in the Harvard affirmative action case that is now winding its way to the U.S. Supreme Court, has studied students at his home university, Duke, who elect to pursue science and engineering and mathematics type curricula. He wants to know how likely it is that students will leave their studies in the technical curriculum before graduating and switch over to softer, less quantitative lines of study. This as a function of students' race and of their pre-admissions characteristics like test scores and grades. Using data on Duke undergraduates, he finds that more than half of the Black students who begin with an intent to pursue STEM area majors end up switching out before they graduate, compared to fewer than 10% of white students in the same situation. But he also finds that if he controls for the test scores and grades of individual students, there is no racial disparity in the probability of leaving STEM for students who have the same qualifications. What his data from Duke indicate is that The Black students there with an interest in STEM, but with lower technical qualifications in their pre-admissions profiles, simply are unable to persist in their study of the technical curriculum. So I wish to ask, isn't such a result inconsistent with genuine equality of respect and standing? Let me give another example. I've been told sotto voce by partners at big law firms in New York and Chicago that they hire associates of color whom they don't believe are all that good. But they know that they're going to have to make some of them partner because the firm can't stand the reputational hit of having a class of partners with an inadequate number of people of color. And without wanting to be quoted by name, they say, I shudder at the prospect in some cases because I know that the people that we're dealing with here are really not as good as I would like to see them be in order to make them a partner in my firm. But the logic of affirmative action in a way compels this. And now I'm confronted, says this hypothetical partner, I'm confronted at the firm with an ex post facto situation in which everybody knows that there are these disparities by race in the performance of people within the firm. But nobody is willing to say so since it is politically incorrect and professionally ruinous to do so. That is the kind of situation that those of us interested in genuine equality would hope to avoid. Affirmative action in 1980, that was one thing. Thinking of that as a year roughly marking the transition from the era of discrimination to an era of aggressive efforts to achieve diversity and inclusion. That, however, is not the same thing as affirmative action as a permanent, institutionalized practice of using racially differentiated standards of selection. The latter, I argue, is extremely problematic. Here's another red herring likely to be deployed to rebut my argument. Putting race aside for the moment, it is a fact, the critic might say, that elite colleges give preferences to people from underrepresented parts of the country, like Idaho, since they don't want all of their students to come from Massachusetts or New York. Call that geographical diversity. Moreover, at a place like Harvard or Brown, the admittance rate for legacy applicants is much higher than for others. At Harvard, for example, children of alumni, about 1/3 of them who apply are admitted, compared to a general admittance rate that is about 1 in 20. So, Professor Loury, my hypothetical critic might continue, you say that fake equality confers a certification of honor and excellence according to different standards of merit for Black people, but doesn't that same objection apply to geographical diversity? And doesn't it apply in spades when you think about legacy preferences? My response to this criticism is as follows. When thinking about the relationship between equal representation and equal respect, we must consider the background conditions under which the various groups in question that we can identify, legacies, athletes, those from rural backgrounds, Blacks, are operating. It's true. The rich kid with 3 generations of Harvard alums in the family who gets admitted ought to have some kind of asterisk next to their name. They got into Harvard only because their father bought their way in, so to speak. That is a kind of blemish, and it should be. Rational inference based on everything that we know means that the fact of selection should not convey the same honor when it is common knowledge that a person got this kind of advantage. But rich alumni kids are not operating against the headwind of racial stigma. You can't identify the beneficiaries of legacy preferences at a glance. It may be that they can live with that asterisk in a way that someone like me, and this is my personal assertion, every African American might not affirm it, would not be prepared to live with. Unfortunately, African Americans have something to prove in such venues. There's a shadow of doubt covering us precisely because of the history of race and racism in America. That's not fair. That's not right, but it's the way that it is. This means that people begin with the supposition that we're not good enough. We often have to show that we're good enough. Again, it's not fair. But given the background historical situation that we find ourselves in, it's the way things are. People know that we're coming in with all of these disadvantages, and we are faced with the need to demonstrate through our performance that we have actually overcome those disadvantages. That's the context in which the burden of the reputational hit that a group might take from being preferred in selection is more onerous of a burden on a subpopulation which labors in this environment of stigma and doubt. Now, that's not an argument for legacy preferences. I think the question of fairness of legacy preferences is a good question, a question that should be put to these institutions vigorously. It's not something that I would advocate, frankly, but I can see the argument for building the loyalty over generations within family lines, the university being a private charity dependent to some degree on the beneficence of its alumni. So this kind of device, legacy preferences, might be used to cultivate the connection to the university within a set of people in the population whose generosity could then be used to benefit future generations, allowing the school's financial aid budget to be more generous for youngsters from modest backgrounds. I can see that kind of argument. I can also see the argument that gatekeepers to elite institutions like the Ivy Leagues might want to have some people of color coming through their winnowing process. This is what Bill Bowen and Derek Bach argue in their book from the 90s, The Shape of the River. That's William Bowen, former president of Princeton University, and Derek Bach, former president of Harvard University, who have a argument supporting affirmative action in that book. It's still readable, I think. It's a very fine study, The Shape of the River. They argue that society as a whole has a profound interest in having within it its stratified elites representative numbers of Black people to sustain the legitimacy of our institutions and to facilitate their smooth operation in our diverse society. I see that argument. I'm with that argument. So I'm not advocating color blindness here. I don't want to be misunderstood. That's another red herring. I'd actually subscribe to what Randall Kennedy, the law professor at Harvard, argues in his book, For Discrimination, recognizing that affirmative action by race is in fact racial discrimination, but saying that it should not be precluded by the 14th Amendment to the Constitution as inconsistent with the equal protection of the laws. That's Randall Kennedy's argument. I subscribe to it. Look, I acknowledge that this is racial discrimination that we're engaging in when we do affirmative action, but it's just not that kind of discrimination that the Constitution was intended to preclude. Kennedy then goes on to give functional arguments about why you might want to do some affirmative action sometime in the interest of society. I'm okay with all of that, but I'm worried about the future. I'm worried about us locking ourselves into a way of looking at Black people. I'm worried about the promulgation of racially differential standards as an institutionalized and ongoing way of life. That is a corruption, and it's inconsistent with racial equality. My concerns about affirmative action don't go all the way down. They're not fundamental ethical objections. I repeat myself, but this is really very important. What I'm asking is, what kind of world do we want to live in 2050? That's just around the corner. Do we still want to be in the business of giving racial preferences for the selection at the right tail of the distribution of human performance to African Americans in the year 2050? I certainly hope not. There is an alternative, and we should be pursuing it. To direct societal attention, to give as much energy as we give to defense of affirmative action, to direct that energy and attention at the underlying structures which generate these differences in performance. That is to say, if I want there to be more Black physicists, or more Black literary critics, or more Black economists, then I should do something about the educational dynamic that is producing such huge disparities in pre-admissions performance of the Black population on those criteria used to select students at elite institutions. I looked at the data that Arcia Decano and company released in the Harvard case. If you stratify the applicant pool by academic index and look down the columns for Black and Asian and white applicants, you can see a very large disparity between these groups in the relative performance of the applicants. But when you look at their rates of selection, the likelihood of being admitted if an applicant falls within a particular decile of the academic credential distribution, the number is much higher for African Americans than it is for whites, and the number for whites is considerably higher than it is for Asian Americans in those data. So that regime necessitates the kind of difference in pre-admissions criteria by race, which will be mirrored, I am arguing, as a statistical certainty by differences in post-admissions performance by race, which is the thing that I'm concerned about here. The stakes are high because with the practice of affirmative action in elite education, we're normalizing a way of thinking about race, equality, and equity that will have far-reaching implications. I'm going to give just one more example of what I'm talking about. It's a personal example. I'm an economist who's been teaching at Ivy League institutions for most of the last 4 decades. I'm pretty good, with many papers published in top journals. Some have been cited thousands of times. I wouldn't mind winning the Nobel Prize in economics one of these days, though, of course, that's very unlikely to happen. Still, excuse me. Sorry about that. I was just not winning the Nobel Prize. Still, it's the case that no Black American has ever won the Nobel Prize in economics. Now, suppose that Black Lives Matter or some such were to go to Stockholm, Sweden, and picket the headquarters of the committee that decides on these prizes, demanding that a Black American be named. That would not be a good thing from my point of view, because the honor that I would like to be able, although it's very unlikely, to bask in would then become unattainable, were there even a hint of political influence on the process of selection. Of course, you're going to say that this is something that only a privileged person could say, and you're right. You may say that, Glenn Loury, you're one of the top percent or percent of the top percent of the people who are doing economics research, and we can live with you not getting an honor if we can move the median of the population in a given direction. And there may be some merit to that argument. This is not about me. But my point here is not really about me or my interests. My concern is to show that there are some kinds of goods in life which cannot be redistributed. The very act of intervening in order to effect a redistribution destroys the quality of the good that is being redistributed. And I think human distinction is one of those goods. I'm issuing a cry from the heart here. Please don't patronize my people. Don't judge us by a different standard. Don't insult us with the soft bigotry of low expectations. This is a plea with gatekeepers to pull back from the brink. I don't know that it's even an argument as much as it is an expression of sentiment, though there is certainly some logic behind it. The consequences of American history have left us facing a huge project of developing the human potential of Black people in this society. The legacy of our ignoble past is partly reflected in deficiencies or inadequacies of performance, so that the relative number of African Americans excelling in certain kinds of rarefied intellectual pursuits is low. Taking the long view of history, the only viable solution to that historical inheritance is a focus on enhancing the capacities of African American people to perform. That's a huge, multi-dimensional, decades-long project. Institutional dependence on racial preferences merely diverts us from that necessary task. Now, I understand that those running an elite university don't have control over all the venues of human interaction in which development should take place. They govern only a very small sliver at the back end of the process. They don't control primary and secondary education. They don't control preschools. They don't influence family life and peer group culture and the extent of economic disadvantage that impede many young people from greater academic achievement. They don't control the federal budget for supporting low-income families and so forth. So there's only so much that these decision makers can do. But from a societal point of view, and that's the point of view that I'm taking here, the challenge before us is to bring this segment of our population to a point where it is able to realize fully the potential that it has, which I don't doubt is equal to the potential of any population group in this society. to some degree, stifled by history, that potential. And I want this to be done in a way that doesn't patronize my people and that doesn't abandon our common standards of excellence. But many of the gatekeepers whom I would like to address are prepared to say, we can understand why African Americans who would like to enter into our selected venue are on average not as distinguished in their academic achievement as others, but that's okay. We appreciate the fact that they've been historically disadvantaged. Not to worry, it's okay. We'll look the other way. We'll establish double standards. This, my friends, is what I am against, because although the motivation may be noble, this policy is inconsistent with the dignity of the African American population in the long run. We're being treated to a certain degree like children. We're being excused from the burdens of performance at a very high level, or in a darker thought, are being presumed intrinsically incapable of so performing. You can see in some venues where African Americans achieve extraordinary success, in competitive athletes, for example, what it would mean to institute criteria of selection aimed at redressing the underrepresentation of other groups in those venues. What it would mean, for example, in effect, is to put an asterisk next to the name of anybody who is preferred in that way. Yeah, he's in the NBA, but he's white. And after all, we know they have to have a certain number of whites and so on. That would be many things, but it wouldn't be genuine equality. So the reflex of people to say, we're going to make a faculty appointment at the university and we don't have enough African Americans, we're going to go out for letters and so forth. These letters on this applicant are just okay, but we need to make this higher because we're a top department and we can't go on without any African Americans and so forth. That resource is what I'm asking that reflex is what I'm asking gatekeepers not to succumb to. I'm saying, wait, I'm saying it doesn't have to happen overnight. I'm saying lowering the standard in order to assuage your guilt or your pity or to cover your asses is not exactly an equalitarian move. And I'm saying that at the end of the day, you don't take us seriously. You don't treat us like equals unless you're prepared to insist that we perform to the same level as anybody else. Finally, let me acknowledge what I can see as a more subtle argument for something like racial affirmative action, one that I would associate with the economist and philosopher John Romer, whose book, Equality of Opportunity, I much admire. Romer argues in that book, he says, let's classify people based on background conditions. You came from an inner city high school. Your parents had relatively low income. Your peer group had relatively few people who were going to college, and so on. You had certain test scores and certain grades, and they may not be especially distinguished given your background conditions. But when I compare you to other people with a similar background, you're way in the right tail of that comparison. That tells me something about you, about your resilience, your determination, your grit, your fortitude, about your aptitude, because I'm comparing you to other people who have similar background conditions in an effort to tease out what individually distinguishes you. For you to come in the middle of the distribution of Harvard applicants from a background like the one that you came from, where almost nobody goes to college, tells me that you are an extraordinary person and that the bet that I'm going to make is a good bet when I admit you. I'm going to bet on that extraordinariness, on that grit, on that determination, on that resilience, on that resourcefulness, on that willingness to work hard. Still, my objective is I'm trying to forecast who's going to perform well, but I'm thinking that you are going to perform well, notwithstanding your modest academic profile in conventional criteria, because when I compare you to others of similar exigency, of similar circumstance and opportunity, you look pretty good. Notice that in doing this, I haven't really changed the fundamental premise that you should select people who are going to perform best after admissions. I've just enriched my prediction model by using relative performance amongst peers as one of the factors. Note, however, that there remains a question of the role that race per se would play In making such relative assessments, Romer's arguments apply with equal force to whites who have overcome disadvantages. We shouldn't want to presume, should we, that the mere fact of being Black is in and of itself a disadvantage bearing on one's capacity for intellectual excellence? Think about what that assumption means. I'd like to close here by saying that this whole debate about preferences in higher education gets far too much airtime when we're talking about racial equality. I think we should focus more on some other things. For instance, there's honor and there's dishonor. The overrepresentation of Blacks amongst the incarcerated population in this country is in the realm of dishonor. You want to talk about inequality and race? Talk about that. The issues of racial justice are much more keenly drawn in that arena. We have a war on drugs, the social malady of the use of these substances, which for whatever reason we decide are debilitating. They're soul destroying. They rip families apart. Addiction is a terrible thing, and so on. And we want to stop the trafficking in these substances, so we make them illegal and we punish people who traffic in them. But we don't take into account the demography of the market for these illicit substances, which inevitably is going to attract disproportionate participation from people who don't have other opportunities, people from disadvantaged communities and communities of color in the big cities. So even if we enforce the law without preference or discrimination, which is a big if, the consequence of enforcing the law is still likely to be an outsized number of African Americans punished. And yet the malady of drug use is a problem for society as a whole. In effect, through that, we are balancing our cultural budget on the backs of the most marginal people in the population when we fill our jails with drug traffickers serving a market that wouldn't exist but for middle class and upper class people engaged in the consumption of these substances. This is a fundamental issue of social justice, which I have discussed at length in my book, Race, Incarceration, and American Values. You want to talk about race and equality? Talk about that. Alternatively, consider primary and secondary education. Whatever your views about school choice and charter schools and so forth, objectively, these institutions are not serving the least advantaged people in our society well. And yet it is a fundamental engine for these people to be able to improve their social position. It could be that you think the schools are underfunded. We can have a debate and a discussion about what to do about primary and secondary education, but the huge disparities in the quality of the educational services available at K through 12 by class and by race and by social location in this country are fundamental issues of fairness. So in my view, racial justice and equity, understood in the largest sense, should be 95% talking about things like that, and 5% talking about who got admitted to the most selective institutions of higher education. They're not unimportant, but it's the tail wagging the dog, if that's the main thing that we're talking about. Thank you for your attention.
That was wonderful, Professor Loury. Thank you. We have a few questions popping up. And so one of them, let me read it to you. So the speaker says, great arguments against affirmative action. However, the issues resulting to affirmative action are complex. And as you say, we should focus on the underlying issues. I believe, I think you used the term underlying structures that drive these disparities of performance. So given that these underlying issues that prevent the historically marginalized groups continue to persist, how do we allow this group to get the type of equality discussed?
What should I do? What should we be doing about the underlying differences in the development of people? Is that the question?
Yeah, I think that I think the question is, okay, if these underlying structures of inequality still persist and they preclude accessing those higher levels, I guess that's an assumption, but how exactly how do we achieve equality of respect given the persistence of these structures?
Well, okay. I'm going to try to respond. I'm talking about elite institutions of higher education, that's a special case. The disrespect that I'm concerned about, or the inequality of respect, comes about from the fact that different standards are used to admit by race into competitive venues like that. What I would do about that is not use different standards for selecting students into those venues, or at least not as different as is currently the practice. If without any preference, I would get 3 or 4% of the student body being of African American ethnicity, and I'm aiming for 12%, maybe I could aim for 8% or even 6%. I would not have as much diversity and inclusion, but I would have a leveler playing field, and I'd have more equality of respect. That's what I could imagine myself doing. Affirmative action isn't all or nothing. I'm not against it as a matter of principle. I'm saying, as a practical calculation, I think we're digging a hole for ourselves. So I would stop digging. But I mean, I don't have a policy agenda here. I would want to invest in developing people's capacities to compete, and it depends then concretely on the circumstances. The Army, in looking for people to admit to the service academies and trying to get diversity, as I understand it, has a program in which a 5th year after high school of prospective applicants to the Servants Academy who come from disadvantaged minority groups might be offered, if their test scores are relatively low, as a way of getting them prepared in the basics of English and math and such like that, so that in that first year they can hit the ground running and not be identifiably less effective in class than their peers. That's one kind of thing that one could talk about. If I'm an institution of higher education, maybe a consortium of them with a 5th year program to encourage students to develop their skills so that they don't have to start behind when they get to university and so forth. But we could go on like this for a long time. What about K through 12 education? Now, this is very, very contentious. I think that the large African American and Latino populations in big urban areas dependent upon public schools for the education of their kids deserve to have the ability to make choices and to avail themselves of alternative sources of educational services for their children. I believe that the competitive pressures that giving those parents the power to vote with their feet would have great consequences in terms of changing the incentives which the public educational institutions face for maintaining their viability. So I would be one who would look very favorably upon expanding educational choice opportunities for young people as a device for improving K through 12. But I don't claim that that's going to make Harvard's admissions policies any easier to implement. It's a complicated, it's a difficult question. And then there are things that are outside the realm of policy. There is the argument, for example, that in certain quarters of African American society, peers regard an interest in the esoteric and the kind of elite cultural pursuits as being inconsistent with their own racial identity. That's to the extent that it's a problem, and I'm not making any massive claim here about it. It's a problem that would be outside the realm of public policy to address. It would be something that African American communities through our cultural institutions and so forth would need to address. But I don't regard that as a primary way of dealing with this problem. Improve K through 12 education for all Americans and for African Americans, and modify the way in which you handle admission so that you acknowledge when you have an applicant whom you want to admit, but who may be lagging behind the general mass of your admittees, that requires being addressed. And there are various ways in which you could try to address it.
It sounded like in your discussion of Romer's book that addressing those sorts of inequalities requires rather an attention to a more holistic set of considerations in terms of like economic, family, school, geographic, etc.
Yeah, that's holistic, you could call it that. That's what Harvard calls its use of personality scores as a way of amplifying the academic scores when it makes admissions decisions, and
Right.
that's all controversial. But yeah, there's nothing wrong with looking at the whole person without being, driven like an automata to compute an average based on test scores and grades and ignoring everything else that you have at hand. There's nothing wrong with looking at the whole person. Note, however, that I would want the holistic approach to apply across the board. It wouldn't just apply to people of color when you were applying it.
Mm-hmm. I'm wondering, what would you say to somebody who said to you, you keep on coming back to terms of honor, merit, the distinction. What would you say to somebody who said to you, no, really what it boils down to is you go to Harvard because that cultural capital you accrue comes with real material benefits. So at the end of the day, you can't just reduce it to distinction. That really what we're talking about here is a sort of catalyst for opportunity, material wealth, et cetera, et cetera. Like,
yeah, I know their argument. It's the prize that you win when you're born right in society, and that's just one of the like the prep schools that kids go to because their parents can afford the tuition and all of that. That there is a stratification process that is independent of individuals' aptitudes or their performance, and it's really just a rubber stamping. It's really just an endorsement of a pre-existing structure of inequality. I would say that if the premise, I'd be persuaded by the argument if I could be made to believe the premise. The premise is that there really, if you look at who gets into Harvard and places like that and who doesn't, there really isn't any difference in what they're able to do, in their ability to engage with the canon in whatever the field is and to be able to master it and whatnot, in their capacity to, sit through a set of lectures on differential calculus or on organic chemistry or on Beowulf and come out of those lectures knowing what has been said, engaging with the text and whatnot. The people at Harvard or at Princeton or at the University of Chicago are really no more talented at doing that kind of thing than the people who don't get admitted to such places. I don't believe that's true. I think it makes a tremendous difference. I mean, I think teaching a class in my economics department with a technical, you say you don't know linear regression. Well, you need to know linear regression and a lot more than that. You need to know linear algebra. You need to know calculus. You need to know a little bit of functional analysis if you want to be a professional economist. You need to know how to work with data. You need to know how to write code. You need to know how to read extremely difficult technical papers and figure out what's being said and then be able to criticize what's being said and absorb what's being said. That's, of course, at the far end of a process of production. But the distinctions that I'm calling attention to, I believe are real. I think that MIT or Caltech or Stanford's engineering schools is not for everybody. I don't think everybody's going to do well there. I think when I look at the data that someone like Arcia Diacono produced from Duke, we have direct evidence to that effect. Half of the Black kids who started at Duke in STEM disciplines dropped out before their junior year. 10% or less of whites did the same thing. Those kids are not making it in those classes. So if you tell me that Duke's engineering school or that the English department at the University of Chicago or the history department at Harvard are not doing anything significantly richer and deeper than what's being done anyplace else, and anybody can do it, then all bets are off, and I'm wrong. I'm wrong about affirmative action. You should just as well admit by random. You might as well just admit whoever applies, flip a coin and admit. I would be wrong, but I don't believe that that's a correct characterization of what's happening at these elite institutions.
In your talk, you characterized how perhaps affirmative action was an eminently suitable policy in 1980, as we're coming off of this long era of discrimination, as you characterize it, but doesn't necessarily pertain to 2021 in the same way. And so one of the questions from the audience is, Professor Loury, do you agree that there is systemic racism in the U.S.? And I'm just wondering, how do you go about thinking about these issues? It's the buzzword of the moment, right? But it's also bespeaks people's sense that not enough has changed from 1980 to 2020 to before?
Here's what I'd say. Of course, there's systemic racism in the United States, but it's not pertinent to the question that we're discussing. I mean, I just got through giving an example of systemic racism. I said the society from the Reagan era on, when the incarceration rate went up like this and the war on drugs was promulgated, sought to balance its cultural budget on the backs of the weakest and most marginal people in the society, who were Black and brown, mostly men, poorly educated, poor, who were out there doing the retail drug trafficking in the cities and getting arrested and locked up. That was a social problem. We decided to address it in a way that was especially injurious to non-white, non-well-educated, marginal people in the society, which we probably would have had a second thought about if it had been, the consequences of it had been falling most deleteriously on the sons and daughters of the upper middle class, of the ruling class, of the white majority, upper middle class majority, and so forth. So you want to call that structural racism? I'm okay with calling that structural. If you want to say that the reason that cities have ghettos is because there was redlining in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, and there were restrictive covenants and real estate deeds and whatnot, and white people moved out of neighborhoods as soon as Black people began to move into them, and that these concentrated neighborhoods in the big cities became places where people could not get traction in developing their human potential and they lacked opportunity, I'm okay with that. Call that structural racism if you want to. I don't have a problem with that. I'm not trying to say that there's not an issue of a history of racism. In fact, I started by saying precisely that there was an issue which had a legacy in terms of the underdevelopment of the performative capacities of Black people. So the question is not does structural racism exist? The question is whether or not racially preferential admissions policies is a prudent response to the consequences of structural racism. I don't think so.
Another related question says, Professor Loury, what do you think we can do as a society to redirect media attention away from this discourse of affirmative action and elite education and towards the more pressing instances that you highlight, such as in the realm of racial injustice, such as mass incarceration, inequality of educational opportunity, etc.?
Okay, well, I don't know how to get the New York Times Magazine to do a special issue on the kind of things that I'm saying I'm concerned about. I suppose that that's going to be a consequences of what the people who are inside of such institutions think are important things. So I don't know is my answer to that question about how to change the discourse, other than I'm doing what I can do to put my views out there as best I can for consideration. My mouth is not a prayer book. I'm not saying that I have to be right. I'm just saying here's something to think about. I have a concern. So I'll do the best I can to try to voice that concern, and that's pretty much all I can say. I can urge anyone else to do the same if they agree.
What do you think about the use, speaking of contemporary discourse and the buzzwords of the current moment, what do you make of the current use of the term equity with respect to these issues? That this is as opposed to equality.
It's very mischievous. The people who use that term are making a move. Okay. What they're doing is they're moving away from equality of opportunity and they're moving toward equality of results. This is my understanding of it. Prove me wrong. I think what they're saying is, as long as there are different outcomes, we have inequity. Whereas equality of opportunity would be to say, we have a fair structure, but their groups don't necessarily come out to the same extent. Equity feels to me like a move that says we are insistent that the end state be one that reflects population demographics. And I think that that's a mischievous position. Now, if I'm wrong, if there's some other meaning of equity and someone wants to make a distinction between the two, I'm all ears. For my money, equality means everybody faces the same structure. That does not mean that everybody is going to produce the same result. And the fact of a different result is not ipso facto evidence of an unfair treatment, because groups are different. We have different histories, et cetera, different cultures, different orientation. What are you going to do about the Asians? You want equity? Are the fact that the Asians are nearly half of the kids that admitted to Harvard, or would be if they were admitted on the same criteria, is that inequitable? And dare I say it, what will you do about the Jews? Jews are overrepresented in lots of stuff. Is there equity on Wall Street in the financial firms, which are overly Jewish? Again, forgive me, because I'm not trying to be anti-Semitic here. I'm just trying to say equity is a mischievous camel's nose under the tent. It raises a lot of questions. If every disparity is an incidence of injustice, then every group that overachieves is suspect as to something being illegitimate in the way in which they achieve their outcome. It's not inequitable for some groups to outperform other groups. That's not inequitable, or at least it's not, in my view, ethically unfair for that outcome to take place. We need to look at the process that produced that outcome. If I find that in some groups, their representation in the high end of performance is greater than their numbers in the population, then I would expect that they would be selected at a higher rate into whatever the selective activity might be, without any questions of fairness having arisen.
What would you say to the idea that there's a certain sort of the goal of affirmative action at elite institutions is to create a sort of trickle down as a way to, I don't want to sound like Ronald Reagan, but a way to shift the possibilities. That, you know, so say Harvard might say, well, we have an obligation to churn out as many students from disadvantaged minorities, because they're going to go out and they're going to have that social capital. They're going to get positions in Wall Street firms. They're going to teach at leading schools. They're going to change the paradigm of how we think about that race. Like, are you sympathetic to that at all? Obviously, you think that it gets just tainted, right? But by shifting the boundaries too much. But I'm wondering if.
Yeah, I get that argument. That, in fact, is the argument in a way of the Bowen and Bach book that I mentioned, The Shape of the River. That's dated. It goes back to the late 1990s. But they were basically saying, we're Harvard, we're Princeton. We are kind of a passageway into the governing elites of the country. And we have a responsibility to ensure that some of those governing elites come from these communities as a way of redressing the consequences of history, but also of stabilizing our institutions in an ongoing way, because if they're not representative, they won't be legitimate.
Right.
I think there's something to that. I credited that. Like I said, I'm not against affirmative action across the board, but I am trying to sound a warning about the use of differential standards as an institutional, permanent institutional practice. And so you have to put benefits against costs. I think some of these arguments about role model effects and trickle-down effects are bogus. I think they remain to be actually demonstrated. I don't know how racial integration of corporate boards, I'm talking about a big Fortune 500 corporation, I'm talking about getting paid $150,000 a year to serve on the board and to go to 4 meetings. And I'm talking about somebody who has got an MBA from Harvard, who is an entrepreneur who gets caught, who happens to be Black. I don't understand how that addresses racial inequality. It certainly is a good thing for that cadre of people whose opportunities have expanded. But our society is not modular, where, you know, people are going home to their racial group at night with their 7-figure annual incomes.
Right.
They're not sending their children to the same schools. They're sending their children to the same prep schools that the rich white people send their children to. Last time I checked, that's what was going on. And I don't blame them for sending their children to the best schools. They're not big brothering and big sistering somebody who just got out of the penitentiary. They're not adopting kids whose mothers were drug addicts and who have been abandoned. Race is not the same thing as a commitment to social service. To presume that a person, in virtue of their racial identity, will, if benefited, therefore benefit somebody else of the same race, is, I think, a big leap of faith.
It speaks to the sort of identitarian commitments of the moment, but maybe it doesn't speak to reality.
I guess that's kind of what I'm saying, yeah.
We have a number of more questions to ask you, but I think that pause might be a responsible place to end the recording. To thank you so much for coming and speaking with us today. Those of you who asked questions that we didn't get to, I apologize. But yes, on behalf of everyone at PC, thank you so much, Professor Loury, for joining us for the first Humanities Forum of the year.
You're welcome, Ian.